Welcome to Avoice, a voice for creators. I'm your host, Daniel Norton. And in this episode, we're going to talk about the letter I got last week from Jose about how do we categorize our images. We also have a great review from another Jose, so let's get to it. Last week, I got a great letter from Jose, and I mentioned, as I kind of replied to it, that I thought this might be a good topic for an entire podcast, and here we are. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the question Jose has, and I figured this time I'm going to read a little bit more of the letter so you can get more of a scope, and then we're going to go into it. But effectively, we're talking about categorizing or defining our photography in this case, or art in general. So let me read a little bit from the letter. I've been following the YouTube channel for a couple of years. My YouTube channel, that is, I imagine. My first passion was, and still is, landscape photography. One thing led to another, and I ended up shooting for 2 local jewelry and accessory brands. I must say it's harder, but very rewarding, and I'm enjoying working with people a lot. Very cool. He goes on to talk a little bit more, and then he says, I've been trying to put my portfolio together. I'm a hobbyist that gets paid. I wouldn't call myself a professional, and since I'm just starting out, I'm doing a little bit of everything. I talked a little bit about that before in a previous episode of the podcast about being a specialist, but let's continue. Okay, question. How would you define a portrait that's meant to showcase jewelry and accessories? Is it fashion photography, commercial photography, product photography? I've been digging online, but I really couldn't find a definitive answer. I'm trying to organize my work so any possible customer can find it in a comprehensive order and rhythm. Okay, so this is actually really important what he says here, and it shows actually a bit of insight that's useful. What I said last episode, and I still stick to, is whatever I would define it as is not that important, or the general photography community. What's important is what your customers would define it as. What you want to think of when you're trying to put your wares out there, basically to do something on a commercial basis, whether it be part-time, it sounds like what Jose is doing, or full-time, is you want to think about how people are going to find you. It's a really good question to have, and it sounds like, Jose, you're going down the right direction. What we want to do, and I've actually talked about this a little bit before as an aside, about the idea of like when websites first kind of became available, it was very interesting, cheaply available as photographers, because we went from having this portfolio of maybe 20 images that were very specific to what we did to this website that had a gazillion images, and oftentimes the categories they were under were super specific, and sometimes they'd have like 1 or 2 images, and I think that was not the way to go. So and it seems to me like you realize that. What we want to do is think about a few things. When I'm categorizing my work, I look at it a couple of different ways. One is the terms that somebody might use to look for it. This is for SEO, search engine optimization, as well as just navigation of the website. Okay. The second thing I want to do is think about how different these things are in form of technique. That is, if I'm shooting, let's say, a portrait and I'm shooting a headshot, they are similar, right? And somebody looking for a shot for business or for a LinkedIn profile is going to probably look at the words headshot, not portrait. Whereas if somebody is, let's say, in high school, or they're getting married, or they need something for a magazine, they might look for the term portrait. But these things are, we'll call them the layperson, they're very similar. The idea of a portrait and a headshot, and this is actually, again, this is also another really good topic, what makes a portrait versus a headshot. But I think that what we want to think about there is, to the average person that doesn't really get deeply into photography, is there much of a difference between the on-white shot of somebody on LinkedIn and the portrait of, let's say, somebody out in a farm, or even like, let's say, I don't know why they're on a farm all of a sudden, but somebody who, let's say, raises horses and they're out on the farm with the horses, right? Is there a difference there? If it's a relatively close-up shot, people might not really define those as 2 different things. They're kind of both headshots or both portraits. So what I'm getting at here is these things are similar, so should be grouped together in a general thing. So you might say something like headshots, portraits. Now, you might call the section people, right, as well, depending on how you operate your business and what you think your client is going to look for. Okay, so let's jump to the side for a second, and let's say that you did something like weddings, because maybe you're thinking this is easier to define. Well, if I'm a wedding photographer, I might just have a website, Daniel Norton's Weddings, and when you get there, you just see a lot of shots from weddings. But I might also break them down into categories, things like bridal portraits or intimate portraits or something to that effect, or the ceremony, right? I may break it down in the same way I'd break down my books. In fact, that's how I would do it. What I would do is I'd look and say, how do I present these final images to my customers? How do they buy them? They're buying them in some form of a book. So I would actually have my website show that, right? So let's say that when you get a wedding album, you've got some images before the wedding, possibly engagement shots maybe, but you have some images before the wedding, you have images during the ceremony, you have images at the reception, and you may have some images at the end. So that's how I would set up my portfolio, right? And if I also did food photography, right, I might have just a small link to that at the bottom of my site, because the primary people I'm trying to attract are wedding people, right? People that want weddings. I don't want to discard the fact that I do food photography, but if it's not my main subject, I don't want to have that be the highlight. Now, thinking of our website or our presentation as a hub, okay, that's the reason why I went there. What we can do is we can create a main website when we're somebody who does multiple things with a very simple design that breaks it down into a chunk of categories. Each one of those individual websites or portfolios, how you want to look at it, should be very specific. So what I mean by that is, if you do weddings, we're going to say engagement portraits is something different. So we'll say you do weddings, you do engagement portraits, and you do food photography, maybe for like people that make wedding cakes and stuff, right? And you may also do, let's say you do boudoir, or maybe you do something different, more interesting. So you do weddings themselves, you do engagement portraits, you do food photography, and let's say you also do travel photography, because there's travel weddings, right? So when you come to my website, Daniel Norton Photographer, you might find those 4 categories, right? Weddings, engagements, food, travel. Now, some of these things might intermix, right? So if I only do travel weddings, I don't actually do travel photography, then I might just put them under weddings and not have that category. I want to think about how these things work together. So in your case, so now I'm going to jump to your case, I did take a quick look at your site. You've got things like you have, images of portraits of people. Then you have portraits of people with jewelry on them that's used for commercial purposes. Okay, so what we want to do there, and of course you have landscape photography. So what we want to do there is we want to think about it and say, well, okay, now what's the difference, right? Is there a difference between the way that I'm shooting these people with the jewelry on and the way that I would shoot them normally? If not, then that falls under more of a lifestyle thing, right? Lifestyle might be considered editorial. Lifestyle could be obviously considered lifestyle. It might just be considered a portrait. But if we're thinking about this in a way that we want to attract clients, we want to call that something that's more of a generic catch basin, something like commercial or advertising. I would lean away from calling things fashion. I'm a little bit of a snob there, being that I did fashion for a decent chunk of my career. A lot of times people list things as fashion that are truly not fashion. So if you're looking to actually get real fashion clients, you don't want to have what I will call fake fashion, waiting for the flames on that one, in your portfolio listed as fashion. You might just call those lifestyle or editorial. You might say fashion style portraits. But I would probably take a shot like you have on your site that I saw, if those are the shots you're talking about, where it's simply a person wearing the jewelry. I would probably call that commercial photography. And what you would do is when you list it, and when you're naming your images, you want to name them the client you worked for. So let's say it's jewelry. I don't know what the company was. Let's say it's Tiffany. You might say commercial photography, and then you've got these images of these people wearing the jewelry, and then you say, Tiffany photo shoot, or something like that, right? Tiffany photo shoot, Tiffany catalog, Tiffany advertising shots. And you want to use these words because, again, this is your SEO. This is where you're finding it. You don't need to have a separate advertising category and a separate commercial category. You can just put them all under commercial because you do a variety of things. If you build up enough commercial photography that you really can categorize it, like let's say you shoot catalogs and you're shooting 10 catalogs a year, but you also shoot advertising shots that are, let's say this is all fashion now, you might have catalog and advertising as 2 separate things. Though what I would more likely do at that level is I would probably have it categorized by the brands, because the brands are going to be impressive, right? If you shoot for Tiffany and you shoot for Roms, is that still around anymore? So you're shooting for these big jewelry companies, it's more impressive to say this was for Tiffany than it is to say it's a jewelry photo, if that makes sense. And people will understand that Tiffany is jewelry. Think about what a client will look for, a potential client will look for. Think about the value of the terminology to that client. Is it more valuable for you to say that you shot for Tiffany, or is it more valuable to have a portfolio that says jewelry with 5 Tiffany shots in it and then 3 shots from an unknown thing or some test shots you did. That's really up to you and who you think is going to look at these images. What we want to do when we have a client looking at our images is to get them enticed to work with us, to give them confidence that we can actually do the job. So showing work that's already been published is often a good route to take when you're looking for that kind of work. So in short, without all talking, in your case, I probably would just call it commercial photography if you have other commercial endeavors. If not, I would call it the brand you shot for if the brand is a recognizable one. And finally, if not, then I might call it something like commercial portraiture. That way you'll attract portrait people as well. This way you're not using this category that you've only got a handful of pictures you can put in there. And then you could probably even put some stuff in there if you shot, let's say, stock photos that are portraits and stuff. But what I would recommend against is the idea of putting a category together that only has a handful of pictures, especially if it's only from one job. Okay, I'm not saying that's what you're doing, but so in other words, if I only have the one job doing this right now, I might not even make a portfolio with that or put it in my portfolio unless I can, wrangle up some other images, and I might call something like client work. And there you might have, some assembled stuff. So let's say you do work for 5 different things. You've got several different clients. They're all very different. Instead of putting 5 portfolios together, one being food, one being jewelry, one being portraits, what you could do instead is call something client work. And then under there, you would put the images that you like the best. And then your other portfolio would be something like personal work or portfolio or whatever you want to call it. The idea being that this is the category. It's client work, and that client work covers these other things. And then as far as SEO and getting words out there is concerned, you would list it in the description of each image and possibly in your bio on the website. You can say things like, Jose does advertising and commercial work for various clients, such as, you would list the names and that kind of stuff. This way you're kind of putting it in that category. But I used to shoot a lot of musicians. Once I kind of stepped away from fashion a bit, my next love was shooting musicians. I really love shooting musicians. And you would often ask them, so how do you categorize your work? And they never would really want to do that. Very few of them would ever, especially if they're indie musicians. I think once you with a brand label, the label's like, this is what you are, this is what you are. But very few people are going to be like, oh yeah, well, we're pop, right? They're going to say something like, well, it's like industrial mixed with hip hop mixed with, because nobody feels like they fit into that generic category. They're an artist, right? They're very specific. But it's important to know what those categories are when you're trying to market yourself, because if you're going to go to a bunch of clubs that feature different kinds of bands, you don't want to waste your time sending your information to a dance club that's all poppy music when you do heavy metal type music. Wouldn't really work with that club. You want to think about these things as a musician, same thing as a photographer. We don't want to put words that are going to turn people off from seeing our images. We want them to see our images. So what we really want to do is think about who we're sending to our website, what they might be looking for, and we want to make sure we put the images in the category that's going to make them look at it. Saying something like client work might work. Saying something like portraits might work. I probably wouldn't call it fashion unless it's specifically catalog work or an editorial piece for a fashion magazine. Some of these local magazines, like you might have a magazine that's called like I live in New York, so you might have like a upstate New York magazine, and they might have a fashion spread in there. Then it would be fashion, right? But even then it would be editorial. And if I only did it once in a while, I don't know that I'd even bother to put it as a main piece in my portfolio. It really depended on the other kind of work I was looking for. You might even just call it magazine work. What is important here is that we want to keep it simple. We want to have enough work per category, we'll call it, in order to make it worthwhile to go into that portfolio. And we want to make sure that it's something that people will look for, and that the people that we're talking about here are the people that are going to hire you. So for instance, in your case, if you want more jewelry companies to hire you, you may want to either call it client, again, if you worked for a client that was a big enough name that people would see, or you might want to call it jewelry. But I think, again, being in your case, because I looked at Jose's stuff, even though you guys haven't seen it, it seems to me to be more kind of commercial, I would call it. It's not specifically fashion in my mind. Looking at it, it's not specifically jewelry shots in my mind, because if I put the word jewelry out there, you're probably thinking there should be some product shots. I didn't see any on the thing. I only quickly looked at the site. If there are some actual still life shots and you have other jewelry you can mix in, perhaps that would work too. But I'm thinking that would just fall under kind of a generic commercial. Now, if you don't have any other commercial work, then I would put it under either client work, which you could then fill with things like portraits and stuff that people have hired you for, and magazine work. And if you don't have any of that, and this is really like one of your very first jobs you've ever done, then I would probably just put the category, I would literally just call it that thing. I'd call it Tiffany's jewelry shoot and make it its own thing by itself for now. This way, people know how to look for it, and they'll see what it is, and they'll see you've done some commercial work, and that will work like that. That's the simplest way to do it. So what does this categorization do for us? Does it help us as artists? I think it does, in a sense that it makes us think of our work externally. Oftentimes when we're creating the work, it's all of our work, right? It's all personal to us. It's all jobs or hobby or whatever. But when you have to present it to somebody else, it makes us think about it and say, what is this work really? Where does it fit? What would it be called if somebody saw it that didn't have any connection to it, that wasn't part of the shoot? How would somebody find it? Think about when you jump online to look for something on Google or whatever. What words do you type in when you're looking for something? That's really what we're looking for here. We're looking for what this work would be called by what I'm going to call the generic public or the clients, not necessarily what we would call it as photographers. So think about it in those terms. If you liked that job and you want to do more work like it, what would other companies that do that kind of work or offer that kind of work, what would they call it when they were looking for you? And one of your best sources might be the person that hired you in the first place. Depending on your situation, hopefully you're friendly with, the people that are hiring you. You could just ask them. You could say, I want to put this on my website. I'm not sure. Like if you were looking for this kind of work, what would you call it? How did you find me? What did you look for when you found me? What were you looking for? And hopefully that will help you understand the point of view of the client or the person that's looking for the images, not the person that's putting the images out there. I would love to hear what everybody thinks about this. I think this is something that I've dealt with since the beginning of my photography career. I'm sure people dealt with it way before then. It used to be much more complicated in a way because you had to print things and carry separate physical portfolios. But then I think it may be more complicated now. I mean, you tell me, because it's so easy to make so many portfolios. Do we overwhelm our clients by having too much stuff out there? So I'd like to know what you think about this. You can send me a message using the Anchor app. The information on that is in the description below. You could also send me an email, adoramavoice@gmail.com, either a written out email that I can read, or you can send me a voice message attached there. Adorama supports this podcast, and you can support them by going to adorama.com for any of your photo, video, audio, or computer needs. Also, check out adorama.com/create no matter what. There's always contests going on where you can win all kinds of great gear. Okay, this review comes from Jose via Apple Podcasts. I'm 99% sure this is a different Jose based on the name here, but I'm going to say it is. Okay, so, an amazing mentor, 5 stars. I've been watching Daniel Norton's videos for a long time now, and I have learned so much. Keep up the great work, Mr. Norton. I look forward to your future content. Well, thanks, Jose. I appreciate that so many of the listeners here have come from some of the other sources. I do obviously videos for Adorama and on my own channel. If you found me some other way, I would love to know. Send me a message. All the information on doing that is in the end of the show. But also, as I mention every week, reviews are super important. If you haven't had a chance and you're enjoying the content, please jump on and it'll at the very least give me a rating. Ratings and reviews are what push you up in the algorithm and let other people find it. If you do take the time to write a review for me, though, I read one a week, so next week it might be yours. Thanks for listening, everyone. I would love to hear what you think. You can send me a message using the Anchor app. There's a link to that in the description below. You could also send me an email, adoramavoice@gmail.com. You could either write out an email and I can read it on the air, or you could write questions and stuff and we could talk about it. Or you can attach a voice file and we'll play it right here on the air and get your voice on the show. Special shout out to Jose. These conversations with you guys sending me messages are what's going to keep this podcast fresh and new. So if you have anything to say, please don't hesitate to send me a message. And I'll talk to you soon.